In this video, we're going to continue a few more examples of finding the composition functions, and in particular we're going to focus on the domain in this video because the domain's a little more tricky with these two functions. So I just want to make sure that we solidify the concept of finding the domain of composite functions. So let's go ahead and get started with this one. It says f of g of x. So we know from the previous video that this is the same thing as f of g of x. So the first thing I'm supposed to do is look at my function f and then plug in g of x for x. So I'm going to plug in g of x, and then that's going to be squared. Okay, so I'm plugging in here, plugging in g of x. Okay, so g of x squared. Okay, so now I need to, when I'm thinking about the domain, I need to be careful that whatever I'm putting in here for g of x needs to be in the domain of g of x. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and write this here. The domain of g of x. Well, what is the domain of g of x? Well, x needs to be greater than or equal to 0, right? Because you can't have negative inside the square root. So the domain of g of x would be 0 to infinity. Okay, so let's go ahead and continue with this. So we're going to plug in something in g of x that's going to be in the domain of g of x. So now I'm going to have square root of x squared. Okay, so I just plugged in g of x. G of x is the square root of x, so I just plugged that in. Now the square root of x, and then it's squared, these two cancel. So I'm left with, the answer is x. Okay, which the domain of, this, of just x, right? If someone were to say, well, f of g of x is x, and then what's the domain? If you didn't have any of this in between information, all you had was these two pieces, you'd say, oh, well, it's negative infinity to infinity. But the thing is, you need to remember that you could only put in things that were valid for g of x, okay? You can't put in, x values that were not valid for g of x. You won't. And you wouldn't get to this step. So the domain then for f of g of x is 0 to infinity. Alright, so now let's do another example. So this is g of f of x, which is g of f of x. Alright, so now for this one, so I'm going to go ahead and plug in f of x for g in g. So instead of square root of x, I'm going to have square root of f of x. Okay, now what am I allowed to put in for f of x? Right, what's the domain of f of x? Well, it's negative infinity to infinity. I can plug in anything for f of x. Okay, so let's go ahead and continue moving forward with this. So now I'm going to go ahead and plug in what f of x is. So this is x squared. Okay, so I have the square root of x squared. Let's see, this can be simplified a little bit. Is it the square root and is it just going to be x? Does the square root cancel with the x squared? Well, pretty much, except there's, one more thing you need to consider, which is, if you take something, so say you take a negative number and you square it, so negative 3 squared, right? And that would be 9. And then you take the square root of it, you'll get 3. So what'd you do? You lost its sign, right? You started with negative 3 and you ended up with positive 3. So this is going to be not just x, but the absolute value of x. Okay? Because, well, the absolute value of negative 3 is 3. So you lose their sign when you do this square and then you square root it. Alright, so now what's the domain of this? So the domain of g of f of x. Well, we were able to put anything in right here for f, and once we got to this step, there's also no restriction on the domain. You don't have any square root or anything, so once you're here, you don't have any restriction. So the domain would be negative infinity to infinity. And there's your answer. Alright, one last example. So in this one, we have g of x, which is g of x. Okay. And so first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to plug in g of x for x. So I'm going to have the square root of g of x. Okay, at this point, I'm going to think, what's the domain of g of x? What's the domain of g of x? Well, 0 to infinity, right? Because I just need this to be positive, right? Inside the square root, I need it to be positive. So the domain of g of x is 0 to infinity. Okay, I continue, and I say, okay, now let's go ahead and plug in g of x. So I get square root of the square root. Well, the square root of the square root, that's basically, if you remember, square root is to the 1/2 power. So that's x to the 1/2 time, to the 1/2 power, which would then be x to the 1/4 power, which is the 4th root of x. Okay, and the domain of this is also, 0 to infinity, because, same reason for the square root. Okay, for the 4th root, it's 0 to infinity. For any even power root, you can't have negative inside. Okay, so then the domain, taking both of these into consideration, all right, and they happen to both be the same, right? So taking them both into consideration, you say, okay, so the domain of g of g of x, g of x is 0 to infinity. And this would be your answer.